el mundo se nos amplía y podemos hacer comunidad más allá de las fronteras.
Muchas gracias Marcela. Esas fueron las palabras de la decana y también directora ejecutiva de la Cátedra Abierta en homenaje a Roberto Bolaño, que es la instancia que en conjunto con la Escuela de Creación Literaria, de Literatura Creativa de la Universidad de Portales, está organizando este evento. La idea es que este encuentro, estos diálogos, se puedan repetir año a año, porque como ha dicho Marcela, la actividad de traducción, al menos aquí, en esta comunidad, es bastante intensa y muy productiva. Y justamente a propósito de eso, quien lidera esta comunidad es Álvaro Izama, y lo invitamos también a dar unas palabras de inicio a este evento. Adelante, Álvaro.
Gracias, Rodrigo. Buenas tardes, recién. Tardes, Susan. Que están acá, Marcelo, Rodrigo, a los y las que están escuchando, a los y las que van a ver después la conferencia grabada, así que también el público también posterior, así que no, dos o tres cosas. Yo estoy feliz, estoy orgulloso y tiene muy contento que la escuela hagamos este tipo de eventos. Me parece que son eventos que tienen directa relación con las conversaciones diarias en las clases, en los pasillos, en los patios que tenemos en la escuela. Creo que el tema de la traducción es un tema sobre el cual y sobre todo la Escuela de Literatura Creativa nos hemos ocupado desde hace mucho tiempo, y que se ha vuelto una práctica también muy, no sé, no quiero ocupar la palabra natural, pero una práctica común, una práctica relevante que tiene que ver con nuestro día a día. Entonces yo quería dejar los invitados a este poner en movimiento y actualizar esas conversaciones que hemos venido teniendo desde hace tanto tiempo, y que ahora me parece una buena hora también de compartirlas con el resto y abrir y continuar este diálogo con otros amigos, otras amigas que pueden también enriquecerla. Nada, eso a los que están mirando, las que están mirando, gracias Susan por abrir estas conversaciones, este encuentro, y nada, quedan todos invitadas, porque también la escuela es una casa, y en esta casa queremos seguir la conversación todos los días. Eso, Rodrigo, muchas gracias por la invitación, muchas gracias por dejarme decir estas palabras, y los dejo contigo y con Susan. Gracias, Kurt, también por la gestión que ustedes han hecho. Eso, muchas gracias, que muy buenas tardes y que parta todo muy bien. Eso.
Muy bien. Hoy día tenemos a una invitada muy, no solamente especial por la relación que tiene con la Escuela de Literatura Creativa de UDP, ella dirige el Centro de Traducción en la Universidad de Columbia, y parte de sus alumnos trabajan también con nuestros alumnos en proyectos de traducción colaborativa. Hoy día mismo en la tarde va a haber una muestra de ese trabajo. Así que nosotros le tenemos mucho cariño. Pero también es una invitada especial porque en el mundo de las letras ella es reconocida como una gran traductora. Su nombre es Susan Bernofsky, es una de las traductoras del alemán al inglés más notables de Estados Unidos. Dirige el programa de traducción literaria en la Universidad de Columbia, que es parte de la maestría en creación literaria de esa universidad. Dentro de eso, ella ha formado una instancia de colaboración llamada Word for Word, donde nuestros alumnos, en conjunto con alumnos de España, de Portugal, de Berlín, y también creo que, no recuerdo qué ciudad de Francia, pero también alumnos también de Francia, trabajan en proyectos colaborativos de traducción. Las próximas publicaciones, porque tiene muchas, Susan, pero las próximas publicaciones que van a salir pronto en el año 2021 de Susan Bernofsky son, en primer lugar, una biografía de Robert Walser, que la va a publicar la editorial de la Universidad de Yale, y también su versión de Thomas Mann, La montaña mágica, que va a ser publicada por W. Norton. So Susan, I have, oh, beautiful. It's a very thick and heavy, heavy book. So Susan, I have just talked to the audience about you. I have just introduced briefly your work and your collaboration with us. And so we are ready to listen to your conference. So thank you for being here. For us, it's a true honor.
Thank you so much, Rodrigo. I am so honored and delighted to have been invited to speak about translation with my beloved colleagues at UDP, and yes, across a lot of land, but with the internet, we are very close. I am going to read in English my lecture, Translation as Storytelling. There is a translation for which I am very grateful by Sebastian Duarte. So thank you, my translator of this essay. Translation as storytelling. Translation is a form of storytelling, a way to give an account of something you've read in another language. Translating, you put into words, your own words, what you found in a foreign work, doing all the voices as if sitting with listeners around a campfire. Even though almost all translations are by definition based on texts written by someone else, the translator's own subject position unavoidably enters into the translated text, adding an implicit second level, a second layer of narration. This complex structural relationship involving original, translator, and translation is most readily visible in the case of retranslations, especially of classic works that already exist in several different translations in a given language. I've been thinking a lot about the stories I tell when I translate, because I'm in the early stages of a massive new retranslation project, as Rodrigo said. Thomas Mann's monumental novel, The Magic Mountain, Der Zauberberg, first published in 1924. There are two earlier published translations of this novel, each admirable in its own way. The first, published by Helen Lowe Porter in 1927, was done in consultation with Thomas Mann and helped secure his international reputation. This book more recently served as an inspiration for Kate Briggs's book, This Little Art. And in 1995, John E. Woods published a much lauded retranslation that was celebrated above all for capturing Thomas Mann's irony and humor. So given that the novel doesn't need a new translation, as it might have if it had been poorly translated in the past, when I was invited to prepare a new translation of the book for Norton, the first thing I asked myself was whether I had stories to tell about this book that I felt needed telling. This train of thought derived directly from my previous retranslations of classic works, Hermann Hesse's Siddhartha and Franz Kafka's The Metamorphosis. In each case, I discovered a story I wanted to tell about the work that I felt would shed new light even after their earlier English translations. In the case of Hermann Hesse's novel Siddhartha, a quest narrative in which a young man spends years searching for the right sort of life, my story had to do with the relationship between the state of grace the protagonist seeks and the lyricism of the prose describing his search. Regardless of how one assesses Hesse's profundity as a novelist, he was a highly gifted prose stylist whose German sentences are almost aggressively melodic, heavy on the assonance, occasionally even cloying in their lushness. In Siddhartha, I felt Hesse was using a sense of harmonic balance in his sentences as a correlative to the novel's vision of the world. It's important to remember that this novel was written in the immediate aftermath of what at the time was still being called the Great War, now World War I. The unprecedented violence of this war, fought with 20th century technology, including chemical weapons as well as tanks and bombers, killed millions of combatants and left many survivors either physically maimed and or psychologically scarred. The word shell-shocked was coined in 1915 to describe the conditions of those who had been through that experience. Hesse began Siddhartha in 1919 and finished it in 1922. So at a moment when all of Europe was still reeling from the war and from the influenza pandemic that followed immediately after, Hesse presented a radical alternative to grievous injury and death, giving his young protagonist all the time in the world to search for his true calling. And the prose that accompanies this project, melodically flowing sentences held together by assonance, represents a state of nirvana, a universe in balance. Everything in this book is about harmonious balance and dignified pacing. I kept this understanding of Hesse's book in mind as I worked sentence by sentence on my translation, cultivating as much lyricism as I could. Here, for example, is the book's final sentence in which Siddhartha's friend Govinda realizes that Siddhartha has achieved enlightenment and gazes on him in wonder. I'll read the German and then the English. Tief verneigte sich bis zur Erde, vor dem regungslos Sitzenden, dessen Lächeln ihn an alles erinnerte, was in seinem Leben jemals geliebt hatte, was jemals in seinem Leben ihm wert und heilig gewesen war. Deeply he bowed to the very earth, before the one sitting there motionless, whose smile reminded him of everything that he had ever loved in all his life, everything that had ever in all his life been dear to him and holy. The first line of my translation is augmented with additional words because I wanted to slow down the pacing of the phrase in which Govinda bows. The English phrase was in danger of having too few syllables, making the action and its narration feel too hasty. To help create the sense of gravitas the moment requires, I doubled the one-syllable verb bowed, even though the three-syllable word it translates, verneigte, appears only once in German. I also added an emphatic very to the phrase to the earth, mostly for rhythm, but also to remove the ambiguity from the preposition to. Govinda bows so low that his forehead touches the ground, but he is bowing to Siddhartha, not to the earth. The very of to the very earth interrupts the possible misreading of the phrase. The repetition of bowed also helps to make up for a chiastic structure I elided later in the sentence, in seinem Leben jemals, jemals in seinem Leben. I chose not to reproduce it exactly because of the oddness, corniness, of writing in his life ever in English. So instead, the words ever in all his life appear in two slightly different configurations. My sentence has two sets of repeated elements where Hesse's only had one. I'm emphasizing what I want to show the reader about his prose. These repetitions rhetorically represent the sense of balance I've been discussing. My last tweak to the sentence was in the syntax of the final phrase, which I rearranged because I didn't think the last words of this book should be "to him," even though the final words in German are the equivalent of "has been." In German, in which so many sentences end on conjugated auxiliary verbs whose low information content makes them functionally invisible, the last words that stand out emphatically are wert und heilig. And that's where I wanted to end my translation too, on the resonant word holy. So wert and heilig, dear to him and holy. New topic. In Kafka's Metamorphosis, I had a very different sort of story to tell. My reading is based on my conviction that Gregor Samsa is a hysterical drama queen, that the story is a comedy, if admittedly a very, very dark one, and that the joke is always on him. Kafka's humor here is deadpan and invariably situational, rooted in the disconnect between Gregor's frantic attempts to do the right thing and his grotesque physical state. As the very model of a company man, he is so horrified at the prospect that he might be late for work, that he disregards the far more serious problem that his body has been monstrously transformed. This characterization spoofs the very notion of dutifulness. His humiliation is funnier yet, and also sadder, because we can see that in some spiritual sense, he has brought this curse down upon himself through his fanatical obedience, which is extreme to the point of absurdity. The funniest part of the story, in my opinion, is when Gregor's father pulls out a safe full of family documents to review their finances after Gregor's transformation. And we discover that the family had plenty of money all along. This comes after Gregor's explanation that he had no choice but to work like a dog to repay his family's crippling debts. It turns out they didn't have any. Once more, the joke is on him. This is a melodramatic sort of humor, so I worked to make the melodrama as clear and obvious as I could everywhere in the translation. Often that meant finding deadpan humor in the use of overly formal language and precise enunciation, playing off the contrast with Gregor's new body, as when his sister has finally found food disgusting enough to be to monstrous Gregor's liking. And here's the sentence in English. Might I be less fastidious than before, he thought, already sucking greedily at the cheese, which is moldy. The humor comes from the contrast between the words might and fastidious, which are elevated discourse, and the low discourse of sucking greedily at the cheese. One instance of drama queen melodrama arises from Gregor's fear that his firm's general manager, who has come to his home to see why he is late for work, will make a negative report about him to his boss. Gregor realized that he could not possibly allow the general manager to depart in his present frame of mind if his own position at the firm was not to be put in the gravest jeopardy. The inflated language of gravest jeopardy brings out the melodramatic edge that I'm looking for. At one point in the story, I used the same doubling the verb technique as in Siddhartha to slow down action that was happening too quickly because the English words in question have fewer syllables than their German counterparts. Gregor has emerged from his room, hoping to coax the general manager into staying to hear him out, but his father chases him back inside. Gregor had gotten through the narrow doorway. One of the double door's wings is still bolted closed, by slipping through sideways. And when he now tries to retreat through this opening on all sixes and at his full lateral width, He gets stuck and has to be pushed. Violently, his father provides this assistance. The phrase describing this action in German is, da gab ihm der Vater von hinten einen jetzt wahrhaftig erlösenden starken Stoß. The word Stoß, meaning push, shove, or thrust with sexual connotations, is preceded here by 3 modifying words, an adverb and 2 adjectives, wahrhaftig, erlösenden, starken, that add up together to 9 syllables, creating quite a bit of suspense in the sentence. I was able to get up to 8 syllables with genuinely liberating, but decided to translate the verb twice to heighten the drama and make sure that the sexual overtones were clear without fully dominating the passage. In my translation, the father administered a powerful shove from behind, a genuinely liberating thrust to free his monstrous offspring from the doorway. So these are 2 examples of how an interpretation of a work can become a storyline that plays out in many small translation decisions on the sentence level. To be clear, I don't advocate randomly adding syllables in every single sentence one translates from German to English, even though English translations inevitably come out shorter in terms of syllable count. I do so only where it seems important to preserve what I understand as the rhetorical strategy at key points in the text. Now to The Magic Mountain, a truly monolithic work of German literature. It's going to take me a while to finish deciding exactly what sort of story I want to tell in my translation, and my story may change in the course of working on these 1,000 pages, literally 1,000 pages. One of the ideas I do already have about it is that the book is one huge inflated fairy tale, as suggested by a remark in the prologue. Besides, it's not out of the question that this story of ours in its innermost nature will bear some resemblance to a fairy tale. There are a number of points, even early in the book, where my translation choices reflect this reading. One of the first problems in The Magic Mountain I puzzled over is the translation of the simple little word einfach, literally simple, that appears in both the first line of the prologue and the first line of chapter 1. In both cases, it's used as part of the unit ein einfacher junger Mensch, literally a simple young person. And in my first draft, I wrote simple young person, and then started trying to find a better word to replace that simple with, since, after all, surely the protagonist of Thomas Mann's great novel isn't a simpleton. I ticked through a number of possible synonyms, regular, ordinary, etc. My partner even suggested the 21st century equivalent, basic young man, before settling on unremarkable, an appealing word that fits well with the arched eyebrow, we're both in on the joke here, ironic tone Mann is cultivating. But then I started thinking about it more. In what sense is Hans Castorp unremarkable? He's not an average sort of person. The first thing we learn about him is that he's rich, or at least wealth adjacent. He's carrying a traveling bag fashioned of pricey and exotic crocodile skin that, as we're immediately informed, was given to him by a consul with a fancy sounding name who is both his uncle and his foster father. Clearly, his family story is anything but simple. Of course, the word might well be meant ironically. Does Mann expect us to be reading in high gear irony mode already by the second word of chapter 1? Maybe. But I started to hunt around in period dictionaries, old dictionaries, to learn how the words einfach and simple were used early in the 20th century. And lo, both words were often understood as the first subheading in their dictionary definitions to mean guileless or artless, i.e. a person senza alcun sospetto, like Dante's famously unsuspecting Paolo and Francesca, who fell in love over a book without suspicion, unsuspecting. And this makes sense. Isn't The Magic Mountain the story of an unsuspecting young man who boarded a train to pay a 3-week visit and then got lots more than he bargained for? I really do think this is the story Mann is telling. So keeping in mind the bit in the prologue where the narrator coyly points out that there's something of the fairy tale in the book he's presenting, what if the translation of einfach really is literally simple? Don't many fairy tales start out with a simple young person setting off on a journey? And if the secondary meaning, not so clever, creeps in as well, maybe that's not inappropriate given the narrator's general tone of mildly amused detachment. Continuing to ponder, I recalled Emily Wilson's brilliant analysis of the opening of Homer's Odyssey that prompted her in her English language translation to describe Odysseus as a complicated man. She notes the etymological derivation of this English word from the Latin plicare, to fold. This is from the first line of the Odyssey. Odysseus is both many-layered, like a cloth folded over on himself, and one who has journeyed hither and yon, many turnings in his past. He is with pleats, the calm and plea of complicated. And it turns out that the pla of simple comes from plicare in Latin as well. Sim signifies self-same, i.e. one. So the simple is that which has only a single turning or fold. Technically, one might object simple ought to be without folds, just as complicated as with them, con, with. Or to use a different sort of example, shouldn't that excellent product that we refer to in English as 2-ply toilet paper actually be called 1-ply? 2 levels, 2 layers. Well, at a certain point, the word designating a fold came to mean a layer as well, making simple the clear opposite of complicated. This all works better in Spanish, I think, than English, which also makes it a not bad metaphorical equivalent for the German einfach, which literally means one compartment. I'm still at the beginning of my Magic Mountain explorations, but for now, I'm going to call the fellow a simple young man. When working on a new translation of a previously translated work, I make a point of not spending too much time looking at the earlier translations out of fear that this might interfere with my getting a grasp on my own vision of the book. Thinking about einfach and simple, however, prompted me to consult the 2 previous translations of the Magic Mountain. The Helen Lowe Porter translation uses simple-minded in the preface and unassuming in chapter 1. So 2 different words. To me, that looks like a copy editing casualty rather than a conscious decision on the translator's part. Translators weren't always able to write oversight of the final edit into their contracts as we can now. John Woods uses the word ordinary in both passages, in keeping with his foregrounding of the book's ironic tone, an ordinary young man, even though he's not ordinary. Another story I want to tell about Mann's novel has to do with tourism. We are frequently reminded that the book's protagonist comes from Hamburg in the German north and experiences the novel's Swiss setting as exotic. He waxes rhapsodic at his first glimpse of the Alps and finds it delightfully quaint that a server in Davos is referred to not as a Kellnerin, the standard German word for waitress, but a Saaltochter, literally hall daughter, a common word for waitress in Switzerland in the early 20th century. Given that I've spent a lot of time in Switzerland and thinking about Switzerland in connection with my decades-long work on Robert Walser, I feel a particular affection for the novel's setting and want to make a point of describing this landscape touristically, as Hans Castorp and Thomas Mann, both of whom hailed from the Baltic coast, would have experienced it at the time. For one thing, I'll probably be calling most things in this multilingual setting, remember that Switzerland has 4 official languages, by their German language names, i.e. saying Graubünden rather than Grison, even though English more usually uses the French names rather than German names. One of the reference works I'm consulting for this translation is a turn of the 20th century Baedeker travel guide. I'm also looking to shape my translation in terms of a really precise accounting of the book's cultural artifacts. Ironically, this is easier for me than for either of the book's previous translators because of the internet and 21st century library access. Helen Lowe Porter translated the book soon after it appeared and had access to Thomas Mann himself, but I can't imagine that he was very interested in explaining every detail of every reference to her. And John Woods was translating 70 years later, but before the internet had become the powerful reference library that it is today. The Magic Mountain is exceptionally full of things that need looking up, and I've been doing a lot of that, both online and in period reference works on paper. For example, Hans Castorp's cousin, the tuberculosis patient he's come to Davos to visit, tells him about a fellow patient who speaks in an endless series of malapropisms, so calling things funnily by the wrong name. One particularly awkward linguistic mistake she makes is steriletto, involving something called a sterilette, which she confuses with the word stiletto. So steriletto combines stiletto and sterilette. At the time of Thomas Mann's writing, stiletto meant only a thin dagger or knife. It did not yet have anything to do with high-heeled shoes. And it would have seemed a fairly exotic word to a German speaker from a sheltered background, like the person being mocked here. Unfortunately, the word she confuses it with is one that is improper for use in polite company, a sterilette, coming from the French stérilet, which is a precursor of the IUD, the intrauterine device, the very same device that early 20th century feminist Margaret Sanger promoted shockingly in her 1921 pamphlet, The Use of the Pessary, so a early birth control device. In translating this passage, I considered defaulting to the same period malapropism, steriletto, that Lowe Porter uses, but ideally this moment in the translation would be more legible to 21st century readers as what it is, a truly cringeworthy gaffe, really embarrassing. Woods translates the word as stirletto, combining the words stiletto and stir, to stir like a pot. So he captures the mispronunciation, but not its unseemliness. For now, I've given up on the word stiletto. I've been playing around with the variants on the word switchblade, having been unable, so since I couldn't find a satisfactory play based on stiletto. So switchblade, the best translation I found so far is snatch blade, using an old word for vagina, which I think shows the cruelty of the men's schadenfreude-driven humor at the expense of this unworldly woman that seems to me important in establishing the atmosphere of Mann's book. So this then is an initial account of how I am approaching this Swiss fairy tale made in Germany. My ideas about the book may change and develop as I work, but I thought it was worth sharing them in their provisional form and as an example of how such a project can be approached. Thinking in terms of the stories we intend to tell about a work is a good way to focus our labors as translators. It also helps ensure that we call things by the names it's most appropriate in the space of our translations for them to have. Thank you very much. Thank you so much for listening to me in English.
Thank you very much, Susan. I think that, well, the text, the Spanish text was being projected along with your reading. So if somebody
Great.
could know the original, they could read it on screen. And I think that many observations were so acute, and many of them were particular to this transit between English and German. But some of those observations are true for any kind of translation. The nightmare, for example, of counting syllables, especially when you are in the world of prose, where supposedly the amount of syllables is not even important until the moment that you read very closely and that you understand the musical structure that is sustaining the whole passage. And then how do you rewrite that musical structure? I just wanted to.
It's not a nightmare. It's a pleasure.
Oh, yes, well,
it's the joy. It's the joy of this reading. I love this.
And I just wanted to know if you have any musical training, because your observation, for example, when you talked about the melodic flow of sentences held by assonance, when you were referring to Siddhartha, it seemed to me that I was listening to somebody who had knowledge not only of the linguistic terms, but their musical equivalents.
It's true. I did study the violin as a child for 8 years. I play very poorly, but with pleasure. But I think having studied poetry, and I don't write poetry now, but as a young person I did, and I studied it seriously. And I think that the study of poetry is like a study of music in that sense. And I think it's important to keep in mind that all writing, even prose, is based on these same principles of rhythm, because rhythm and rhetoric are so closely combined. I think you can convince people of things more if you say it with the right rhythm. People believe you more, And so I feel that when we write the translations, we have to convince people of what the original said, in a sense, being conscious of rhythm.
Let me translate just the summary of this small exchange for the people who speak Spanish. Bueno, estábamos hablando con Susan. A mí me llamó la atención el detalle con el cual ella describe esta dificultad que existe en la traducción cuando se pone atención al flujo musical y también al ritmo. Al punto que yo le cité una pequeña frase del proceso que ella dijo en su conferencia, específicamente cuando se estaba refiriendo a Siddhartha de Hermann Hesse, que ella hablaba del flujo melódico y también hablaba de la asonancia de las oraciones. Y sucede que, claro, por lo general uno piensa que en la prosa la atención al ritmo y a lo musical no es tan importante hasta que uno lo lee con atención y se da cuenta que hay una estructura musical que sostiene toda la obra. Entonces yo le pregunté si es que ella tenía entrenamiento musical justamente con la precisión que ella lo escribió y claro, lo confesó, tiene 8 años de violín, no se tiene mucha fe como intérprete, pero aquí queda claro que gracias a su entrenamiento con el violín, ella logró también afinar ese oído y lo está dirigiendo hacia la traducción. As I was translating this part, Susan, I was thinking that perhaps your 8 years of violin should be mandatory in the education of any especially if somebody is prone to put attention to the musicality, especially in poetry, as you were saying.
Well, what about dancers? I bet dancers also approach, writing and translation through this rhythm of the body.
Of course.
I'm not a dancer.
Of course. So we will build the perfect curriculum with some years of violin and piano and some years of ballet and salsa. What do you think? What do you think about that for the future?
Perfect. Perfect. Perfect.
Okay. So I'd like to thank you, Susan. Thank you for your generosity. Thank you for your words. I think that I'm going to return to Kafka. I hadn't thought of Gregorio Samsa as a drama queen. I think it's hilarious. And of course, I will put more attention in Govinda and try to analyze the musicality of his respect and submission, if that is reflected in musical terms in the translation into Spanish. And one thing, there's this thing in German that the levels of German are so marked and so easily identified when one is reading German. And although every other language has this register with different levels, there's no official boundary between them. In German, that crossing those boundaries and making a joke or even destabilizing the world is much easier because of those rules or those customs. How do you get in English? You try to explain that, but I guess that it's more a topic of a conversation than something that can be very well rendered in a book.
It's difficult. It's a constant struggle. It's a constant struggle. Yeah. I mean, I think about examples in English, though, if you want to show rudeness, I think you have to exaggerate these things in English to make it clear that you've changed the level. I mean, in Spanish, at least, you can do the switch from du to sie, the formal to the informal, the to usted, we don't even have that in English. So it's much harder for us. It's much harder for us to show the levels.
Well, there
are
two comments. First, there is someone, her name is Constanza Veloso Luarte. She's not making a question, but she thinks that this connection between rhythm and translation is marvelous. So she's in flames, just like we are after listening to your lecture. And Kurt Folch, he wants to know if there is something to pay attention within the Magic Mountain, especially these days of pandemic.
Yeah. In fact, I just wrote a little essay about this because the complexity of that situation. The Magic Mountain was written during the 1918 influenza pandemic. Thomas Mann does not describe it in the book. He ends the book at the beginning of World War I, so he does not describe the 1918 influenza. But his daughter had influenza. He lived through it. And I think that he has enfolded his experience of the pandemic onto his descriptions of tuberculosis in the book. And I feel that very strongly, the irony of translating this book while in quarantine, in isolation, which I've spent a lot of this time in quarantine in New York. So it's all a little bit too, everything is about everything. The irony of it is a little overpowering, but I think that it helps. I think my emotional trauma around living through this pandemic will perhaps be good for the translation of a book that was also written under trauma. You know, he wrote the book during World War I and during the pandemic. Those things he does not describe in the book, but you feel the trauma, I think, in the book.
Okay, so Susan, thank you very much. We are under a very tight schedule, so I'd like to thank you. We have to go.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me. It was such a delight to speak with you.
Oh, it's great. And well, all these conferences will be, are recorded and they will be posted in our website. So if you want to use them for your classes, you can direct your students in the future.
Excellent.
Here.
Excellent, excellent. I'm so glad.
Okay. So
Thank you.
Gracias a todo el mundo, gracias por seguirnos. Esta es la primera conferencia, la conferencia inaugural. Luego continuamos a las 3 de la tarde con, un evento también que se llama La Mesa del Traductor. Viene Mauricio Lectorat y Soledad Marambio. Después, a las 4:15, viene el taller Word for Word, un trabajo colaborativo de autores en formación. Y a las 5:30 tenemos a Megan McDowell y a Cristina Cordero también en un diálogo acerca de la traducción. Así que nos esperamos entonces y muchas gracias. Okay, goodbye, Susan. Thank you very much.